Exciting days ahead in fascia research. I hope you enjoy this interview. Welcome to the Essential Therapies podcast. Dr. Cindy Hodgson here. I am a physical therapist and exercise physiologist coming from a John F. Barnes Myofascial Release Approach background and offering you many ideas about essential therapies and especially focusing in fascia. And I'm super excited today to have with me a special guest, Dr. Carol Davis. Once again, welcome, Carol. You just came back from the Fascia Research Congress that was just really kind of pivotal, and you have some great information to share. So with that, I'm just going to ask you to give us a little background of who you are and where you come from, and then dive into what you found different this time at the Congress.
Thank you, Cindy. It's good to be back with you. My background is as a physical therapist. I graduated from the first master's program in physical therapy, Case Western Reserve in 1969, and I began my clinical work at the Mass General Hospital. And at the time, I was a little discouraged about the science that I was learning in undergraduate and graduate school because it didn't seem to fit with human science, cardinal plane exercises and so forth. So I got caught up with PNF as a way of expanding my basic science into spirals and into functional activity and to holism. But it wasn't until 1989 when so 20 years later, when I took a Barnes course, John Barnes course for the first time in Fort Lauderdale. I was at the University of Miami, um, on the faculty there. And all of a sudden, I recognized this was what I was looking for in my practice of physical therapy. This was the energetic link that was never taught. And so I began to recognize how critical the principles that Barnes teaches connect me as a therapist to my patient in this resonant energy, although I didn't have the physics background to explain it. So I did a deep dive into physics, and I spent the next 5 years really looking at quantum physics and getting ready to write a book about how integrative therapies, we called them alternative or complementary therapies at the time, might enhance what we do in rehab. And my first edition of Complementary Therapies in Rehabilitation, that book came out in 1996. At the same time, John Barnes and I were continuing to stay in touch. And John opened his Western Treatment Center in Sedona, and he was sending me articles and books, and I was sending him articles and books on with the one main goal of finding out the science that reinforced the principles that Barnes was teaching. What am I talking about? The principles that Barnes was teaching, the different principles that we learn right away. You have to be present to the patient in a different kind of sense than an analytical. He calls it channel 3 versus channel 5. That you press down lightly until you feel the collagen, until you feel the fascia. Press straight down and then take the slack out. So it's compression and tension, and then stay there for 3 to 5 minutes, following the fascia as it reorganizes itself. The patient leads. Look, notice the pain, look elsewhere for the cause. All of these principles that John was teaching then became even more clear in 1998 when Donald Ingber came forward with his article on mechanotransduction. He did the science to show that manual pressure experienced over the skin results in electrons and infrared energy coming out our hands into the fascia that's embedded in the skin, goes down into the extracellular matrix as energy, as potential energy, and hits as kinetic energy, hits the potential energy, and through the process of melting or thixotropy, which is what happens with soft crystalline matter, through piezoelectric effect, the this extracellular matrix melts a little bit and electrons flow and there's communication throughout the whole web. 1998 or 1999, Donald Ingber's seminal paper is still the basic foundation for Barnes' work on the impact of subtle energy and vibration on fascia. Then later, with each International Fascia Congress in 2007, I was not in Boston, but Barnes people were, and they saw Strolling Under the Skin with Jean-Claude Guimberteau. We saw live fascia for the first time. And John said he got tears in his eyes when he saw that because he realized that's what he was visioning. So now all of a sudden we saw the polygons. We saw the constant movement, always moving. We saw the soft tissue. We saw the fat globules and the muscles and the blood vessels embedded within the fascia. Then we began to see it's not just wrapping, and it's not just that tight strapping tape kind of look. It's very fluid in some places, and so more and more of the research was being presented. Robert Schleip started talking about the effect of manual therapy, but so often they were looking at pressure in terms of pounds per square inch. They weren't looking at the effect of subtle energy. And so a lot of papers came out saying, I'm not sure that the pressure that we place on but with our hands really does anything in the fascia. It's too thick. They weren't looking at energy. They weren't looking at what moves in the way that it moves. And then Gerald Pollack came out in 2012, I believe it was, in Vancouver with H3O2, that water is crystalline when it goes into our bodies. So all of a sudden, that triple helix collagen was wrapped with a crystalline water, so that when we pressed on it, something very special happened. The H3O2 opened up, and the electrons went to one place, and the photons went to the other, and it became a battery. So all of a sudden, now we knew where that charge was coming from through the tissue. And then Paul Stanley got up and said, look, we did these Petri dish studies and we put pressure on, granted, pieces of fascia. We stretched out the pieces of fascia and pressed on it. And we waited to see when went the interleukin response, the little microscopic messenger molecules. When did that happen? Well, nothing happened much before 3 minutes. And then 4 minutes it started to happen, and 5 minutes it started to happen. And so Stanley came forward to say, this is why sustained release is so powerful. So little by little by little, at every fascia congress, we saw things, the science was opening up, but there was no invitation to the clinicians to talk about Barnes. There was no invitation except aligning it somewhat with one of the sponsors of the Congress, and that's the Rolfing Association, the structural integration folks. So we waited and we waited and we waited. And then last time in Berlin, the big piece was Neil Thies's stuff on work on complex organizational systems and how fascia seems to be the structural framework of a complex organizational system, and that and all of the characteristics of complex organizations can be seen as being the foundation of this life that we live inside of us, very different from machine life. Um, 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 all kinds of emergent properties and constant death and rebirth of cells and so forth. And then the interstitium work with cancer. That was really important in Berlin. But this year, okay, Seventh International Congress. How's it going to be different this year? The researchers are going to give last time was in Montreal. No opportunity for clinicians to really have much of a say. Maybe in a pre-con course, but no mention of biotensegrity. Maybe in the questions, but everything was biomechanics, everything was parts, not everything, but the emphasis was that way. So the Barnes people would get together in small groups and talk about what the science that they just talked about impacted Barnes' work and what we do. This year, it was totally different. I submitted an application to talk about my dissertation because it had to be science-based. I said, okay, I did this dissertation and published a peer-reviewed article on empathy. And I talk about the transcendent moment of empathy as being energetic. And then I said, and what about resonance in with fascia and with the patient practitioner interaction? And they said not only when I submitted it to as an abstract to the scientific review committee for the Congress, they said, well, we want you to do a hands-on workshop with this. And I thought, what? They don't just want me to present the peer-reviewed literature on this?
Yeah.
So I said, well, okay, I can do that. So I had 1 hour, 8 to 9, which is a luxury, um,
Hmm.
to talk about empathy and transcendence and interoception and um, connection between the therapist and the patient. And it was my opportunity to give the principles of John Barnes. I thought maybe there'd be 20, 25 people there. I said chairs and mats would be fine. If there are tables around, we can use all of that. About 80 people showed up. The whole room was, they were all over the place. So I said,
Fantastic.
okay, well, we're still going to do this. And I said, if you're going to find a partner. Do you want me to go into this now? I mean, I haven't even given you a chance to.
No, it's
You
great.
want me
Yeah,
to tell you what happened? Okay.
sure, sure.
So all of a sudden, there's a different feel to this Congress. All of a sudden, clinicians are being welcomed. And then I was able to then, what I did was I talked about interoception and fascia. And I talked about a research project that showed that the what the therapist was thinking about at the time that they were placing the hands in a Barnes myofascial release manner impacted the autonomic nervous system of the patient. That what the therapist was thinking about impacted what the patient was feeling in a parasympathetic way through functional MRI. So I said, we're going to do an experiment. I had them split up into twos. One will be a giver and one will be a receiver. And the giver is going to give a transverse plane release over the sternum, a diaphragm release. And I showed them how they were going to place their hands for 3 minutes. And then they're going to rest, and then they're going to do it again for 3 minutes. During one of those two times, when you place your hands, you're going to be thinking about what's happening between my hands, very much like Barnes suggests. Drop down to your body, get out of your head, drop down, what's happening between my hands, and really focus on, excuse me, the response of the fascia. During the second time, or the first time, if you decide to do the first time, you're going to count backwards from 100 so that you're not thinking at all about what's going on with your hands. And then I got them paired up. They were on chairs, they were on the ground, they were on tables. And I said, okay, everybody stop. And I took them through a meditation, like John does, bringing the energy up through our feet as a golden light up into their calves, up into their thighs, breathing the energy up into the pelvis, into the thorax, up into the shoulders and out the arms and hands, up into the neck and out the head, and to feel that golden energy as patient or therapist. Then, therapist, place your hands like I showed you and decide, is this going to be the time that you're going to be focusing on energy, or are you going to be thinking about something else? And then I waited for 3 minutes, and then I had them take their hands off and be very quiet, replace their hands, and then do the second 3 minutes, and then feed back to each other what they experienced. Ask your person, was it the first time or the second time that you felt that I was really paying attention? Probably 100%, if not 199%. They raised their hands, got it right,
Wow.
correct the first time. Then I had them switch, and I had the patients become therapists, and we did the whole thing all over again.
Wow.
At the end, I talked about Barnes being the founder of this kind of approach, about mechanotransduction, the Ingber study, excuse me, about the Serratelli study of what the therapist is thinking about or focusing on in their brain directly affects the insula of the patient. I gave them all the research, and then how did we finish up? They gave feedback. And one person said, I've never experienced a connection like that ever in my life. One therapist said, you're validating my very best practice. I just didn't have a name for it. And then from that moment on, that was at 7 o'clock on the second day in the morning. The whole rest of the Congress, I kept getting feedback. Did you hear what Carol Davis did? Did you hear about the Barnes work? And everybody wanted to know more about the Barnes work. And so finally, um, John Barnes was there. Then the other time that I spoke was a 1 o'clock round table, and I anticipate, I said, I'd like to have a discussion about what the data shows and what people believe about fascia, um, biotensegrity and consciousness, interoception and consciousness. You know, I can't leave interoception out of anything that I do anymore
Yeah.
because we don't have a thought without a feeling. We don't remember a thought without a feeling. We don't have an experience of anything new without it being colored with something that happened to us before. We just don't pay attention to it. But now we're recognizing the autonomic nervous system, interoception, the vagus sympathetic, parasympathetic link colors everything that we experience. And so I expected, again, 10 to 12 people in a roundtable discussion, and 60 people showed up. So they got me to a bigger room, and we got 5 people deep all the way around the room. And I said, I really wanted this as a discussion. This is going to be a little bit hard. So the way I want to start is I'm going to talk to you about some of the things that I came up with in preparing for this. And because I want to keep us on a certain track. I don't want us, for example, to get sidetracked into um, whether consciousness really is real or not. I said, what I want to talk about is the link between our emotions, consciousness, and fascia, and what fascia has to do with it, because this is the Fascia Congress.
Yeah.
I started out by talking about an A.T. Still quote. Fascia is the space within us where the soul dwells.
Yes.
That was early 1900s, I said. And then fascia as tissue, and fascia as tendon or muscle, and fascia as structure to separate muscle fibers, and fascia as something that is a part of a system, but only part, 19% of what's inside of us. All of those ideas about fascia. And then John Sharkey came up with a wonderful quote, you never honor the ocean by calling it a river.
Mhm.
You can never honor the ocean by calling it a river. Well, people took off on that about the bigness of fascia, about energy, about how we never had a chance before in the Fascia Research Congress to even talk about energy. Nobody was even mentioning it. And they started to celebrate this concept of energy and energy transfer and how your thoughts actually determine your mood. And Robert Schleif's introductory lecture keynote about the role of fascia and the immune system, and how if you are in a positive state, if you're depressed and your fascia is fibrous and your immune system is going berserk, but if you're positive, your fascia it responds very differently, and it was really quite inspiring. They really got off on the energy piece. And I got as many of the Barnes quotes in there as I could, and talked about the fact that this was the pioneer. This was the person who allowed us to be thinking about this in a way that was supported by James Oshman in Energy Medicine, the New Science. And then we talked about biotensegrity and how the push-pull energy of biotensegrity allows for the volume within the fascia for the flow to take place, and how Barnes maintains that that flow, all of those flows are important, but perhaps the most important flow is the flow of the mind, that which is the essence of who we are, orchestrating the homeostasis, the homeodynamics, as Joanne Avison says. of health, that no healing, as John says, can ever take place in the intellectual mind. All healing takes place in the body, in the mind of the body. We talked a little bit about unwinding, and Sue Hitzman was there, and so she was talking about some things, and Sharkey was there. I think Gil Headley was there talking about the importance of the vagus nerve. So the main presenters that are aligned with energy were also there. Um, so that was huge as well, and I got my my comments about the fact that Barnes was the first voice that we heard, and that voice that was shut out for so long. And
Mhm.
then the third major presentation was a co-presentation that I presented with Sue Hitzman. Now, Sue is a master clinician. She has never taken a Barnes course, but she's interviewed John Barnes and me about the concept of unwinding. Sue wrote to me and said, "Look, and before we knew that this was going to be different, she said, I need a person who has a doctoral degree to submit with me so I can get in. Will you be a gatekeep opener for me? Will you help me with Um, this presentation on the science of unwinding?" And I said, sure. I said, we did it before with the Fascia Hub. She and I
Mhm.
presented, I think, a 3-hour presentation on unwinding. And so she put together some slides. She interviewed John. Then she interviewed John and me on unwinding on an anatomical gangster podcast. So she's looked at the research. The way she was taught, this is interesting, and it has to do with serendipity too. In the 80s and 90s, when she was learning, she was a movement therapist. She was in the fitness industry, and she developed the melt method with the soft rollers. She knew about soft tissue, and she recognized the danger of those black styrofoam rolls, that fascia didn't respond as well. But she didn't know the science behind it. And then she came upon a teacher who she learned manual therapy from, and she gave me the teacher's name, but I don't remember it. And that teacher was teaching principles very similar to Barnes. Allow the patient to lead, always follow, never project yourself into the field. And so she was learning Barnes principles without John's name attached to it from somebody else. Then when she heard what I was presenting with Barnes, she said, this is the closest thing to what I'm doing. And so she interviewed me on her podcast, and we saw how much of an overlap there was. So she put together these slides on unwinding. We only had, believe it or not, 20 minutes to present slides and 10 minutes of questions. So she put together some slides. Uh, I summarized the research that was out there that spoke to what is unwinding and what's the science behind it. There isn't a lot. It's basically an argument about ideomotor response. Ideomotor response is when the body has a thought that you're not aware of, a kind of like an unconscious thought, and your body moves in response to that thought. Um, but that work is not related to revisiting trauma. And John's powerful aspect of teaching unwinding is unwinding has directly to do with stuck energy in the fascial system. It has to do with energy that needs to be unstuck in order to be able to come to a reconciliation of a trauma, whether physical or emotional or sexual or both or all three or whatever, to come to a reconciliation of that moment in yourself so that you can reclaim, literally reclaim the whole of you. That's, of course, not possible to prove, but the reports of people, including yourself,
Yeah.
the reports of people when they go through an unwinding that is exactly that. It's a movement that you're not really aware why you're moving or how you're moving, but in the midst of it, what you realize is something's happening here that's helping me to untangle something that seems to have been stuck in this movement, and it can be very ballistic, it can be repetitive, and you get to a quiet still point and your eyelids flutter. And John says he thinks that, he can't prove it, that that's when the energy, the essential energy of the person goes out into the cosmos, reorganizes itself, and then comes back in, and you get very, very heavy, and then you drop to the floor or drop to the table. And then when it's over, people say, my pain is gone." Or that wonderful story about the man who lost his energy, a financial expert that didn't, or lost his memory, didn't have any memory, couldn't get to, he even forgot how he got to the center. And then when they were working with him, he heard a pop. And he said, "I felt like my brain drained." And John reasoned, and I think this is a powerful reasoning, that there was a restriction on the venous drainage of the meninges around the cranium. And when that release of stuck fluid and energy, all of a sudden the brain cleared, and the person didn't have any problem with short-term memory or long-term memory anymore. Now, how do you explain that?
Yeah.
Those are real life stories that John has been collecting year after year after year after year, just waiting for the science to come along and describe. Um, but he hasn't had to wait. He said, "Come on, just do it.
Mm.
Just treat patients. Don't read, of course, read. Try to understand, fine. If patients ask questions, use metaphors. Don't try to explain quantum physics. Show them strolling under the skin. Talk to them in terms of wet and dry sponges or flowing trees or whatever. And if you can
Mhm.
connect with nature, of course, that's even better because we're just reflecting the flow of energy through nature, through trees and plants and animals of all types. So there you have it. How many minutes later? Thank you.
That
What
was
was your question?
that was amazing, Carol. Talk about flow, right? But
Yeah.
I just want to tag onto that a little bit more. So that just kind of goes into even more about Barnes. And you had said earlier that, Barnes in the 80s was grounded in this type of work describing the essence from within and, being sort of hung up of not having the science, deciding to, you know what, I'm not going to waste my time waiting
Yeah.
for the
Yeah.
2025 Fascia Congress. I'm going to start treating people. Thank
Right.
goodness. Right.
At
You
one
know,
point, we wondered when the 100th monkey would come, and this was in the late 90s. And he says, "I think about 2003." I said, "Oh, I think probably around 2005 when you'll start selling out. You won't be able to hold all the people that are trying to get in to hear about this." And here we are. If he would have said, "Well, 2025, maybe I'll get my foot in the door in the federal."
so
Or,
here we are, and so many things have just come up. Let me try to bring it back. I want to bring up your comment about Andrew Still. It's funny because I have a slide presentation that I give, and I have a picture of him with that quote that I had found somewhere as well about where the soul dwells.
yeah.
And how can we possibly think that we could scientifically analyze that, right? So at some level, what are your thoughts on science itself is limited in this regard,
Yeah.
don't you think?
Yeah.
And on some level, where do we draw that line? Or
Mhm.
maybe we can't. I don't know. Your thoughts on that? Like how much of this do we really have to scientifically value before it's really given the honor that it deserves in my mind, right?
Mhm. Well, what you're really talking about is a cultural phenomenon.
Mhm.
And there are a couple of starting points where we got to where we are with Sackett's golden rule of randomized trials being the gold standard of validating fact in scientific research. I always tag it, and Makosi does too in his book, to a 1919 review of medical school science, the Flexner Report. The Flexner Report came out and said medical schools around the country And he
Mhm.
and they kind of alluded to Hahnemann in Philadelphia, who was really a homeopathic school. Medical schools around the country are really teaching snake oil science. All medical schools need to follow the Johns Hopkins model. And the Johns Hopkins model is you have to prove that what you did is reproducible in the same way by somebody else, that it's not a quirk, and that so there's reliability, and that what you did made the difference, the key difference in what you measured as a response. It wasn't done by something else. So that's validity and reliability. And the only way you can do that is through a randomized trial. You take two people, you randomize them, one to the experimental group, one to the control group. You do the experiment on the person, and then you have a blinded person measure the results. They don't know what they got, the real one or the fake one. And then you do another one, a fake one over here, and then you can establish, and hopefully you use a placebo. Actually, if it's a pill, you do the active pill and you do a placebo, so the person actually got a pill, but it was a fake pill. And then, of course, um, we started to recognize in the 80s, this isn't working for people, it's working for chemistry. But
Mhm.
it's not working for people because people change. Both the therapist and the person receiving change and the evaluator. They're different. They see different things. And then quantum started to creep in. That what we see, what happens is very much affected by, in a subtle energy way, by what we're looking for.
Mhm.
And then Ted Kapachuk at Harvard said, I'm going to study this placebo thing. And he started studying placebo, and he actually looked at the fact that people got really better with placebo, and they didn't have any side effects. And so
Mhm.
then that was at Harvard. And Herb Benson at Harvard said, these monks are able to lower their blood pressure and lower their heart rate for hours at a time through meditation. The mind is able to take charge of the body. And
Mhm.
so all of a sudden, in my first edition of complementary therapies in physical therapy or in rehabilitation, my first chapter is what is the science behind rehabilitation? And I said,
Mhm.
the only thing that we have provable is the Benson work on psychoneuroimmunology, that what we think affects the neurological and the immune response in the body. You can't separate the mind and body anymore. That
Mhm.
was my foot in the door. And then
Yes.
everybody else was talking about integrative therapies that were energy based. And I talked about fascia. And John Barnes had an article on a chapter on myofascial release. Then we started looking at biotensegrity, and we started looking at the role of photons, and we started looking at how and Jim Oshman came out with his energy medicine and all the stuff on vibration. So then the next edition of complementary therapies and rehabilitation, I said, let's take a look at fascia and biotensegrity and their role in integrative therapies. And so I started to talk about Jim's theory that vibration is all there is, energy. And
Mhm.
then the third edition came out, and they started talking about the impact of photons and how photons are making such a big difference in the extra energy as a subatomic particle. And photons are different from electrons. They don't have they don't have a orbit. They're just packets. They're either
Mhm.
wave or particle packets,
Mhm.
and they're energy packets that are going into mitochondria and providing energy. And so all of a sudden we had to say, well, we've got to start including quantum in our understanding of
Mhm.
science. So this now we're in the mid 90s and late and early 2000s. And then the Ingber work came out, and that changed everything. But not many people were able to really understand what he was talking about with that icosahedron and
Mhm.
Thixotra. They didn't want to pay any attention to that. They just
Mhm.
wanted to say that if you did this myofascial release for 20 minutes and somebody else did an elbow, you had a different result.
Mhm.
Well, I did a study like that. I said, okay, if that's the study you want, I took normal, healthy students that had limited hamstring length in straight leg raise. And I put they drew a paper, and half of them got myofascial release, Barnes myofascial release, and half of them got elbows, shiatsu massage. And then the evaluator on hamstring length, straight leg raise, didn't know which they got. And so we did a pre-test of of the only thing we measured was range of motion of hip flexion with a straight leg raise. So we did a pre-evaluation of hip flexion immediately post, 15 minutes post, half an hour post, 24 hours post, and 7 days post. So that's about 7 readings.
Mhm.
Um, what we showed was a change. And when I did Barnes myofascial release, I may have wedged, I may have done, I may have done, I didn't do just hamstring work. I did wherever the problem was that was affecting the hamstrings. The
Mhm.
person who did the shiatsu was just doing elbows to the hamstrings. Both groups showed a change, a positive change. And what we saw over time was the myofascial release group started to drift back along with the other group. The other group drifted back to their pre experiment range faster.
Mhm.
But the myofascial release group never went back to their original.
Wow.
So I tried to publish it in the Journal of Physical Therapy, and they said, well, this is interesting. It shows a trend, but your N is too small. What I did was I did 30 students, 30 or 40 students at Miami and 20 students at FIU. When I went back to get the FIU students, they didn't show up for their 7 day piece. So I published it in the Journal of Manual Therapy, Manual and Movement Therapy, um, um, massage and manual therapy, something like that. Journal on massage and manual therapy. That's it. And that has gotten quite a few hits. Um,
Mhm.
the the final analysis is this. I posted on my Facebook page the video that Rupert Sheldrake gave that got him kicked off of the TED Talks.
Mhm.
Rupert Sheldrake basically says you cannot do science without looking at energy and mystery. You cannot pretend that you're studying the human condition under any kind of circumstance without allowing for quantum events and mystery. And they kicked him off TED Talks. Well, it so happens that now there is a group of scientists that are listening very carefully, particularly to the near-death studies of scientists who've had near-death experiences. Um, the most famous is the neuroscientist from Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. What's his name? I'm about heaven. He was a neuroscientist, pure scientist, went into a coma for a week, had vivid memories of being in that coma, connecting with an entity that gave him information, came out of the coma.
Mhm.
She said she was his little sister, came out of the coma. And he said in this dream state, coma state, don't have a little sister. And she said, yes, you do. So when he came out of the dream stuff, this neuroscientist started to heal. And his mother came to see him and he said, do I have a little sister that I don't know about? And she said, well, actually, yes, you do. I had a miscarriage before you were born of a little girl. So Eben Alexander is his name, Eben Alexander. He left neurosurgery and began to write and has been part of a movement of post-materialistic science. These are scientists who are willing to say there's something more that needs to be studied beside what we can measure in matter. So
Fabulous.
now these post-materialistic science papers are starting to come out. Not a lot, but there's a lot of bioenergetics is a field that's starting to be taken more seriously. Shamini Jain, Shamini Jain, is
Mhm.
a person that you should look for, and Beverly Rubik, persons that you should look for science, written peer-reviewed articles where, very much like the Seratelli article, that there's some sort of energetic link with information around us, into us, and out of us. that is available when we attune to it. And that's Barnes paying attention. What's science asking for? What's the message I'm getting here?
Mhm.
So the long story is we're moving in that direction. One of Sheldrake's famous books is How Do Dogs Know When Their Owners Are Coming Home? And
Yes.
it's that wonderful study of how they try to trick the dogs and get
Mhm.
out of routine, but the dogs are sitting there at the front door before the owner comes in, knowing energetically that their owner's on the way.
Yes. Absolutely believe in that and experience it as I walk with my neighbor's dog and have for about 10 years. She found me on one of my walks, and then I met her owners, and they tell me she knows when you're coming, and it's always different. Like I'm not going every day, so
Uh-huh. Yeah.
it's really amazing. But going back to your presentation at the Congress, you're showing that, like, just in that wonderfully
Yeah. On the
together little
hands-on.
experiment. I
Hmm.
mean, you can't change the fact that okay, that placebo was the counting backwards, right? And that
Right.
powerful connection, which of course us as Barnes therapists have, if we're doing what John is teaching in these courses. Of course, there's multiple courses that people can take, and you retake and retake again and get treated so that it's
And understand it a little better and a little more fuller, a little
right and
better. It hits at a different
experience
level. Yeah.
it more. And so what you showed all of them there is just is beautiful. So I'm wondering, that type of experiment with a much larger N, okay, would that satisfy science in the way that we know it now, or what needs to happen to be able to do this? And I remember having a conversation with John, oh gosh, 2001. I believe I just finished with my PhD in 99, and
Mhm.
all gung ho about research, and talking with him. And he's like, no, I was like, he's like, I could feel his, like, don't waste your time sort of attitude about it. And not much longer after that, I kind of could see why I felt the same way. I wanted to help people. And,
Mhm.
I really learned so much more probably from that
Yeah.
than I would have trying to fit in this scientific box, which is very channel 5, that whole
Yeah.
left brain thinking aspect versus that channel 3 space. But one thing, Carol, in regards to unwinding, as you've talked a little bit about bringing in this sort of this energetic piece, this quantum space, the soul aspect, right? We talk about it as affecting the being within the fascia. The consciousness is within the fascia, this crystalline matrix, okay, and how that is creating structure and function within us, and how that's connected to our inner awareness, our emotions, our
Mhm.
thought. And also knowing that thoughts, and there's lots of research out there now, whether it's, and even you mentioned it before, Bruce Lipton and the biology of belief, and there's
Mhm.
the Greg Braden stuff, and Joe Dispenza and You Are the Placebo, and all of these
Right.
things measuring the frequency of our thoughts and how it affects our body. Like, I feel like that's been pretty established lately in research, and whether it's considered scientific or however it's viewed, thought and energy type of thing. How do we connect that with the fascia? Because I feel like when I listen to this group over here, they're missing the fascia. And then I hear this group over here that's very structural and biomechanical, and they're missing the energetic part of that fascia. And I feel like there needs to be a bridge between these two spaces. What do you see happening, in subsequent Fascia Research Congress, or maybe just in clinical settings, where we can start to bring this out more and make this bridge where we're connecting this other piece that you've been aware of since the 80s once you found John?
Well, I'm curious about what is it about fascia that you want to have primary in the work of other people? Why is that?
I feel that there's this energetic piece, this soul piece that can't be very well researched, right? Because we're all changing all the time.
Any more than consciousness can.
Right, right. So how do we,
Why is fascia important?
Right. Why is it? And how does that connect to the consciousness
Mm.
piece? And when we think about unwinding and how sometimes in a position in space comes up and these emotions come up, and sometimes we become consciously aware of it and a memory surfaces, but other times John says we don't need to. If your if your mind feels that you need to be made aware of it, or if you need to, then you might be aware, but you may go through this softening of this stuck energy or releasing of the stuck energy without having a conscious memory of something. But where does that fit in? How do we make that more common outside of just what we know as practitioners? Maybe we
I
don't
think,
know that.
yeah, I think that I know what you're getting at. I think that well, you come from a biology. Well, you don't really come from you come from a
Oh, I
physiology
do.
background,
Yeah,
and so
physiology.
obviously fascia is important to you. And it's not very important to psychologists, and it's not very important to some other. Might not be. It should be important to Dispenza because he's a chiropractor, and it should be important to Bruce Lipton because he taught anatomy, and it should be important to Greg Braden. No, he was a geologist. So
Mm-hmm.
it happen. I guess it depends on where you're coming from in terms of how your lenses are set. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that our only job in life, really in getting through life, is to be responsive in the most meaningful way to what unfolds in front of us
Mm-hmm.
for our learning.
Mm-hmm.
And I I came up with this quote from some work that I was doing with my own little chat GPT and about the meaning of fascia and the meaningfulness of the presence and understanding of the fullness of this tissue, and came up with fascia seems to serve as a threshold where light becomes life,
Mm-hmm.
and where the infinite speed of intention meets the slow pulse of embodiment.
Mm-hmm.
And in that way, paying attention in that way, we can be responsive then in a different way to what is unfolding in front of us. And when we're responsive to what's unfolding in front of us, we can look at it with curiosity if we're not bound to cultural directives that so much is happening in our country and other countries around the world now, bound by cultural directives about good and bad and right and wrong and in and out and me and other. But if we're responsive in a way of being curious, isn't that interesting? And then our curiosity leads us to how is it? How is it, especially in the consciousness studies, how is it that I became aware of that? Oh, it was that odor. Smell is a very powerful remembering piece for us.
Mm-hmm.
Or that reminds me of something that happened before. Or I'm curious about how I might not get in my own way of my learning. I'm
Mm-hmm.
curious about what is it inside of me that allows me to feel alert and alive. Is it enough to just drink water? Okay, I'll drink water. And John says, no, that's not enough. It's not enough to just drink water. Well, why not? Well, if your ground substance of that substance inside of you that is allowing the flows
Mm-hmm.
is condensed and rigid, the collagen is fibrous. You need to change the nature of that substance inside of you. And then, yes, the water that you drink is going to hydrate you in such a way that the flows then it will be possible for you to once again feel good about yourself, feel good about life, be curious and energized and inquisitive about life. And then what? Life becomes more meaningful. Life becomes well lived. life becomes filled with gratitude and appreciation. When we go to sleep at night, we can say, ah, that was a good day.
Mhm.
That was a good day.
Yes, the life that's flowing through us, I often think that, as life leaves, what happens to our bodies? We become solidified and stuck. And I was on one of my morning walks on my dirt road years ago and came upon an animal that was hit and was stiff and was not even been that long. And I had this awareness of the stiffness in our
Mhm.
bodies that we create is an area of our body where there's not as much life flowing through there.
Mhm.
And as we are able to open that and loosen that and soften that, so it's less solidified and more fluid, like John teaches, there's more life going
Yeah.
through the
Yeah.
being. And that's often what I think of when I'm with a patient is I want to create a better flow of life and love. Because as John said in my first seminar with him, it all comes back to love, right?
All comes back to love.
And that's that place of consciousness and that soul within.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
yeah.
That's what it's all about for me.
Yes, and me too. Wow. Thank you, Carol, so much.
My great pleasure. Thanks for your good questions.
We could go on, and maybe again we will. So thank you so much for being just the voice of the John Barnes Myofascial Release Approach at this Congress. And it's very exciting to be here with you and to see this explode as the 100th monkey is dancing away.
Right. I'm grateful to you, Cindy, for the questions. I'm grateful, of course, always to John for prevailing and persisting in the face of criticism, in the face of disbelief, so that so many of us now can receive and respond in ways that make life so much richer for all of us.
Agreed, agreed. Thank you, John. We love
Thank you,
you.
John.
Thank you so much for watching. Please consider liking and subscribing and sharing these videos from Essential Therapies.